Okay, hi everyone. I don't think I've ever put my face out there, so yes, I'm Kate. I'm gonna just do this little video on Mercury Retrograde because I talk about it a lot and I get a lot of messages about it. And this one's been a little chaotic, so I think it's kind of a good transit that we've been having to sort of explain why, I say that financial astrologers don't trade during Mercury retrograde, ideally, if they do, the way that they kind of maybe change it up a little bit. And I guess why it affects the markets, which is the whole point of all the sort of stuff I talk about, is how planets affect markets. I guess I'm coming more from astrology than finance, but it really is both put together. So first of all, Mercury is a planet that goes quite quickly around the solar system. He's actually the fastest. So there are three or so Mercury retrogrades a year. They last about 3 weeks each. And that's why you'll get, you don't sort of hear of all these other planets I talk about, like Jupiter this big, exciting, happy planet, and he takes like a whole year and a half to get round. So that's why this happens a couple of times a year. Retrograde just means going backwards. So he stops, and then he reverses, and then he goes back again. And there's also a little bit on either side called a shadow period, which some people may see me talk about. If I have a chance, I'll get to that later. So I kind of won't use that for now. Mercury has a little nickname known as the trickster. And I'll just come at it from a finance point of view, because I know everyone's just more interested in finance than markets, which is what I'm always going to try and do with all the stuff that I do. I'm not really trying to talk complicated astrology. He's called the trickster because he just creates havoc and he likes to play tricks. And a lot of this stuff is Roman Merriman that I've done a lot of my studies and learning from, so I'm not trying to plagiarize anything, just as a little note here. One of his best known tricks in finance is he blows out support and resistance levels. A lot of people would say, I've seen a few people say stop hunting, which is something like that, but he is just really well known, and sorry, I just call it a he, it could be a she, whatever, but anyway, he is just known to just not care about support and resistance. So that is kind of one reason why people don't trade during Mercury retrograde, is that charts become a little bit useless, and most good traders or technical traders, whatever, use charts. Also, one of the things he's very well known to do, and what Mercury, and this is just out of the finance sphere, doing things in Mercury retrograde, there's often a sort of theory that says whatever is implemented or done or started will likely have to go back and be redone or revised, go back to the drawing board. It may not happen, things like that. So I think a really good example is Trump, on the weekend saying we've got this great deal with China. Yeah, it's all good, it's all happening. And then 5 seconds later, he's like, or the media has said, no, that's not really it. He needs to, they almost said he needs to revise it. And that happens nearly all the time. And that's in your personal life, especially in finance, which I'm talking about, things like that. I guess often you'll sort of see me saying don't buy IPOs that come out during Mercury retrograde. That is a sort of quite clear rule of financial astrology. You do have something like Facebook, which IPO during Mercury retrograde, but it's quite often that companies are a bit of a dud that IPO during that time. And look, for me, if I see that they've sort of listed during Mercury retrograde, I will never ever touch them. The Facebook IPO itself was a really good example, because when it actually came out, it was absolute chaos. The market halted. It just went into chaos, and that is a very typical Mercury retrograde IPO kind of thing. So that's something to be a bit aware of as well. Also, what will happen is that each time Mercury retrograde comes around, they will be quite volatile, particularly if whatever planets were aspecting at the time, especially if Uranus is involved. You can expect some kind of drama going on. Mercury rules communication, electronics, anything sort of tech. So another thing that happens during Mercury retrograde is that often you'll see big dramas with broker platforms. Orders won't work, things just shut down, it's chaos. The airport shut down. I think I remember the last one. Tech just goes a bit crazy because Mercury rules tech. So look, I have said don't trade during Mercury retrograde. It is very hard to not make a trade for 3 weeks. I would probably bet most people can't do it. I've been quite good this one, but I nearly always make one little trade, and many times I will regret that one trade. So what happens during Mercury retrograde? They say to always check your stops. Maybe don't trade as big as you usually would. Maybe reduce your position size. Double check all your orders. It's very easy to add an extra 0, and you don't want, you know, a million or something instead of 100,000. Lots of little things like that. So it's a matter of just taking extra care. And as I said before, don't bet on support and resistance. I guess another thing not to trade is that I personally don't believe any announcement that I see in Mercury retrograde. I think it's all a bit full of you know what. So if I see companies saying they've made deals, they've done this, done that, it's likely the deal will have to be revised and it won't actually be what they have put on paper. Something could go wrong with the deal. It's just, it all falls within that rule of Mercury retrograde. It's just going to have to be redone, revised. It could just be full of you know what. So it's just a kind of very just volatile period. It's an unsure period, and it's kind of full of lies. And I think Donald Trump is probably a very good example of stuff like that. I guess things to also with Mercury, why it causes so much havoc on the markets, it's just creates volatility. It just creates it's sort of, it's really weird. I don't really know why it is, but markets just go haywire all the time, every time this happens. And a big rule of Raymond Merriman is that he says there will be a trend change every 1 to 3 days. I was actually surprised that we got 3 full days in a row of the market going up. I have said I think that Jupiter conjunct the Sun had a lot to do with that. That's actually one of the absolute best transits that you can have. It's full of positivity. There's very little chance the market's going to go down, and I think that was just so strong. It actually kept the markets going up for 3 days, because it's quite unusual during Mercury retrograde to have 3 up days in a very kind of constant trend. Mercury retrograde is just volatility. My mentor on Wall Street actually loves it. I know a couple of other traders that I know actually love Mercury retrograde because they love the volatility. You know, you get a lot of people, and you'll see the VIX, you know, UVXY, TVX, whatever, will really kind of spike a lot and go down. And you know, some people really have that trading style where that they sort of thrive on that adrenaline. I'm a bit zen. I like my yoga and stuff, so that just, you know, it's just something I'm not into. So, you know, that's that other thing when you know, astrologers say don't trade, that's just not going to work for some people. But, you know, if you're using charts and for indexes personally are something I would never touch in that period, just because it's that whole support and resistance thing. They're just going to take a stops, and you're just going to get wiped. You're going to lose a lot of trading time, and you're probably going to get back to right where you started. Speaking of that, I think I put on Twitter the other day, there is a rule that, again, Raymond Merriman has said, that markets will often return back to the level where they were when they started. I've seen it work and not work. This one was almost to a T. I think it needs one more, it ends tomorrow. So we need one more day to see where that has happened. It's not something that I would put in my sort of golden rules, because I've seen it work and I've seen it not work. And if I sort of have a rule or a kind of, you know, something noteworthy, I'd probably want to see it work more often than not. But he is probably one of the best, you know, financial astrologers, and I think you really need to take into account anything that he says. So yes, it'll be interesting to see where the Dow ends up. Bitcoin, something I have seen crash or go the other extreme every single Mercury retrograde. Again, that is something I personally, it's not something I would trade anyway, but I would never touch that. I think especially that Bitcoin is, you know, it is tech in a nutshell. It's everything tech is, and it really, really reacts to Mercury retrograde. I think also, if you look, I don't know this, I actually have Mercury on my ascendant, so I am ruled by Mercury. I'm very Mercurian. I have a lot of ideas and things like that. So that will actually, and also I'm half Gemini, Gemini Cancer. So being that my ruling planet is Mercury, I especially try to not trade as much as it's hard, but it really does affect me. So I do make a lot of life things with that. I try not to book planes. Plane travel is one thing. Often when you book trips during Mercury retrograde, you can expect something to go wrong. Just be prepared. I always leave an extra half an hour, if not more, to get to an airport, double check everything. So yeah, it really does affect me. So if you do have any Gemini in you, I would probably take heed of some of this stuff, especially because you will be a little bit more affected by that. So that's kind of, in a nutshell, why we don't trade. It just creates havoc in the markets. It creates volatility. Someone says one day is likely to be, or not likely to be, but it can be retracted the next day. It's probably going to be retracted at some point. I guess all this Brexit stuff is another really, really good example. I think that Brexit thing is just crazy anyway. I don't know how anyone trades with that. But these things get retracted, they get changed. What is said today is not what it is tomorrow. Just be really, really careful of any announcements. Don't believe they're set in stone. Don't necessarily, not saying that people are liars, but just don't expect them to be what they are. And just think of the trickster. There is a little shadow bit, as I said at the beginning. So the shadow is kind of like, something sort of is going one way at full strength, and then it stops and it goes back the other way, and then it goes the other way. It just takes a little bit of time to kind of get back to where it was. So this shadow that they have at the beginning and at the end just means that the chaos can sort of linger around a little bit longer. It's not as bad. I have read, and I don't know whether this is right, but I have read the beginning shadow tends to be a little more, I don't know worse, but you would pay attention to the beginning more than the end. I mean, you can't sort of put off life for 3 weeks, 4 times a year or whatever. But, just certain things, you might take the shadow into account. This is not finance, but they say don't buy a house during Mercury retrograde. That's a really, really big one. Don't buy cars, computers, anything electronic, because it's likely to be a dud. So, yeah, I think if I was going to buy a house, I probably wouldn't want the shadow either. I actually did buy a house during Mercury retrograde many years before I was using all this financial astrology, and I ended up in court. So that's enough of that one. So that's a very big golden rule. They say you can sell because, and this is also stocks actually, so we'll say this. So you will see me sometimes trading or sitting on the computer, I should say, rather than trading during Mercury retrograde. It's because it's a very good time to sell stocks. It's said that people pay too much for stuff. They get all a bit excited, and they will pay too much for something during Mercury retrograde. So if I'm sitting around the computer, it's probably in the hope that one of my stocks is going to move and I'm going to pull it out and sell it, which doesn't happen very often, but when it does and I see an announcement, I'm going to get that baby out of there if it's time. So yeah, so that's kind of why, I sort of might be at the computer when I'm not booking holidays and stuff like that. Same with houses. They say, I have read it's a good time to sell a house because you may get, more money than than you may not have, but you can also expect the sale may go wrong. There could be some sort of complication. The seller could the buyer could pull out. So it's a bit of a double-edged sword, that one. Personally, I wouldn't list a house then. And I guess that's sort of back to stocks. One more thing I'll say is that if you do buy a stock during Mercury retrograde, it's quite likely it will be a dud. And you can go back through your portfolio and look at times that you've bought something, and this stupid stock that will sit there and just never, 12 months later, 2 years later, it's often going to be that damn stock that you bought during Mercury retrograde. It's quite an interesting thing. So that's kind of just a sort of little silly thing, but yeah, they're duds. So that's about it, really. I think I was talking about the shadow. I think I'm just going to say, the 3 weeks are really important. You can't sort of not live your life, but you just got to be a little bit aware. When it's fully sort of finished, this whole sort of transit, that's when you can do things very clearly and with a little bit more confidence, and not have any kind of all these worries and stuff. I'm not going to trade for more than 3 weeks. That's just enough. That's not realistic. So I think sort of in shadow, I'd just be a little bit more mindful and sort of get back to it. So that is a little bit of why not to trade during Mercury retrograde. I have never done one of these videos, so you'll hopefully have to bear with me, and you can actually, if you want to message me and ask me anything, you can. I'm still working on this book. It's nearly finished. I've just got to, you know, this is very sort of the typical bit when you get all this stuff out, and then you've got to try and make it make sense for people that don't want to learn astrology. So it's nearly there, hopefully by the end of the year. I probably should have been doing that during this Mercury retrograde, but again, if I put it out now, it's probably I probably would do something very wrong in it and I have to go through and do it all over again. So yeah, so that's the rules, and hopefully some people didn't trade as much with all my little bit don't trade, but I know no one listens to that because it's very hard not to trade. Okay, that's all. Bye.